All right, y'all, continuing our conversation about transportation, we are going to focus on some of the environmental impacts of our transportation system, particularly of our focus on automobiles and the impact that has on our environment. But just a reminder, if you haven't already done it, that the Community Sustainability Assessment is due April 3rd. I'm not going to read the description of the assignment. Y'all can do that. It's posted on Canvas, and obviously I've talked about it before, but I do want y'all to make sure that you don't forget to turn that in and get that taken care of. And the grading is here as discussed. So again, that's all posted. It's all available for you. If you do have questions, you can shoot me an email. Let me know what's going on. All right, so the activity for today's lecture is to make a list of all the environmental and economic costs associated with driving a car. Not all of them, obviously, but just come up with a few. Some of the things that driving a car does present in terms of environmental and economic costs, both for individuals and for the larger community as a whole. We talked obviously about some of those costs in the prior lecture in terms of road maintenance, road construction, all of that, but certainly some other challenges that come from it. So moving along, there are some different levels of impact from driving a car. It's a scaled impact from the global, right? The greenhouse gases that are produced through our transportation system. It's one of the major sources of greenhouse gases is our transportation network and automobiles. So we have a global impact to climate change coming out of our tailpipes. At the regional level, we have things like vegetation damage, acid rain, we have loss of habitat as our transportation system pushes development to farther and farther out. Also, roads themselves at the regional and local level serve as a barrier to migration and to movement of animals, so certainly an issue there. And at the local level, what we tend to see is a concentration of pollutants along our roadways. So neighborhoods adjacent to major transportation systems often have higher levels of localized pollution, particulate matters, those kinds of things, higher rates of asthma associated with that, and so on. So when we think about transportation, we need to recognize that our impacts happen at different levels and different scales and different intensities. So we want to make sure that we're thinking at those different scales when we're addressing some of these environmental challenges. So as this slide says, right, traffic and transportation is a major contributor to air pollution in our cities, both from just the tailpipe emissions, the different chemicals and volatile compounds that are emitted from the tailpipe, as well as particulate matter from road dust and tiny bits of rubber off your tires, all of those things that are kicked up into the atmosphere as we drive are certainly contributors to declining air quality. And the chemicals associated with car emissions have known impacts on human health. And you can see on the chart on the left side, you can see the particulate matter and air pollution has a pretty steep drop off as you get away from transportation networks, but there are some significant impacts in proximity to our transportation system. And typically the people living closest to highways tend to again be those low income and oftentimes minority populations that already have challenges associated with their condition, and being in proximity to transportation adds to the burdens they already face. And as we've talked about before, regulations have improved air quality over time. So things like lead in 1970 something, they took lead out of gas, and so prior to the 1970s, gas had lead in it, which obviously is a significant issue because when you're breathing in the lead, it builds up in your system and it stays in your system and creates neurological disorders and other issues. So being exposed to lead is very, very bad, and removing it from our gas made an instantaneous and enormous difference in air quality. And things like sulfur, other pollutants that are emitted have also been cleaned up because of clean air legislation. And our cars have gotten more fuel efficient, more cleaner in terms of the emissions that come out of our cars. And so we've seen reductions in air pollution, but some of that reduction has actually been offset by the fact that we are driving more, and the more miles we drive offsets the improved efficiency and reduction in pollution caused by cars just because we're driving them more. So every county in the United States is assigned an air quality rating, and those air quality ratings focus on 5 different measures, or 6 different measures, sorry. First is carbon monoxide, which is obviously a bad thing, lead, nitrogen oxides, particulate matters, PM, which is measured at 2 different scales. PM10 is particulate matter with a diameter of less than or equal to 10 microns, and PM2.5, which is smaller than 2.5 microns, also called fine particulate matter. And that's the one that's really dangerous, because those fine particulates are the ones that can get into your lungs when you're breathing, and they're the ones that once they're in your lungs, they kind of stay, and that contributes to asthma, can contribute to lung cancer, other health issues with those ultrafine particles. Ozone is the next, and sulfur dioxide. Sulfur dioxide is one of the primary drivers of acid rain, which we've talked about being a huge issue back in the 80s, and much less of an issue now as we've cleaned up a lot of those sulfur dioxides. And what these air quality ratings allow for is that when the federal government is giving out transportation dollars for projects, those dollars can't be used for any project that will add to air pollution or that will make air pollution worse. And so you'll see when transportation projects are doing the environmental impact assessment or the environmental impact study, they will look at how the transportation improvements will actually reduce air quality issues by reducing congestion, decreasing the distance cars have to travel, whatever it is. They will look to justify reductions in air quality or air pollution, as a way to justify the investment in that project. So some other issues related to our transportation system is noise. So living in proximity to highways and the noise that they produce contributes to increased blood pressure, adrenaline levels, depression. It may contribute to dementia. This study here, the picture here shows that there's increased risk of dementia if you're living within, proximity to the highway. So certainly some issues associated with that. And again, the populations that tend to live in proximity to highways and so forth are those lower income minority populations that already have burdens in other elements of their lives, and this is just an additional burden that they have to deal with. Our transportation system also contributes to inactivity because we sit more, and a lot of our walking is just walking to our car, getting in our car, sitting in our car, driving to where we're going, waiting to find that closest possible parking space, and then walking into wherever we're going and sitting down again. So our whole environment is designed around keeping us on our asses, which contributes to health problems, right? Significant percentage or significant portion of the increased obesity rate is because our physical environment makes walking more difficult, makes it less safe, makes it less accessible, so people are more likely to drive just because they have to. So we get fatter, and The more you sit, the more susceptible you are to things like high blood pressure, heart disease, all of these other health challenges. And again, this is a transportation issue, but it's also a land use issue because we've designed our cities and our communities to be auto-dependent, auto-oriented. We've segregated uses, built these sprawling residential neighborhoods where there's nothing close. You can't walk to the store to get a gallon of milk or whatever. You have to drive wherever you go. So we've created physical environments that force us to drive, and that's leading to health impacts. So significant issues there that we need to think about in terms of how our communities are designed and the way that that interacts with our transportation system. And what you can see here is looking across the globe. You can see cycling rates are the green line. And so we are here down the lowest rates of cycling and the highest rates of obesity. And as you go across the list, you can see that correlation between increased walking, cycling, transit use and decreased obesity rates. So countries like the Netherlands, for example, where I'm supposed to be right now, and obviously I'm not, I'm sitting at home recording this lecture instead of wandering around Rotterdam looking at how they manage stormwater, and it makes me sad, but that's neither here nor there. Communities or countries that have higher rates of cycling and transit use have lower rates of obesity. So again, that comes down to our patterns of development that make us reliant on cars and so forth. So we also see issues of land fragmentation. So as we sprawl, as we build more roads, we open up more land for development, we turn farmland and forests and other open space into subdivisions and neighborhoods, and we lose access to that open space, and we fragment ecosystems, we fragment habitat, we make life harder for Mother Nature to do what she does, and we just make life, again, more auto-dependent as we continue to sprawl. So this map here is, it's kind of insane if you actually think about it. This is Williamson County, Texas. It's the county just north of Austin and Travis County. And basically what they've done with their proposed transportation system is smack a giant grid of arterial roads over an entire county. So we've talked about, or maybe I didn't talk about it in this class, but a grid network is great for a city because gridded streets allow for greater access. It allows for easier modes of getting around. It allows for pedestrian access, cycling access. It allows for, if one road is blocked, you can just go a block over to another gridded street and avoid the blockage or the congestion. It's an efficient use of land for urban environments. But what they've basically done is take that grid network and throw it over an entire county. And you can imagine, one, how much land is actually being used for roads in this proposed development. The red is the proposed arterial facilities. And so you would have an enormous loss of farmland, habitat, all of those things. They're basically trying to turn this entire county into one giant suburban sprawl pattern of development. So you'd lose a ton of habitat, you'd lose a ton of agricultural land, you would just really contribute to massive auto-dependent sprawl across the entire county. And additionally, you'd have the enormous cost of building all of these roads and the enormous cost of maintaining all of those roads. So from an economic and an environmental standpoint, this idea is kind of batshit crazy, to be quite honest. And so this is just a concept map. There was a ton of pushback when this map was published in Williamson County. A ton of people kind of were like, whoa, this is crazy. We can't afford this. We're going to destroy the character and feel of our county by doing this. We're going to lose the rural environment as we build this network of roads and basically just become a giant suburban blob. And so not likely to happen in real life, but it does show you basically when traffic engineers are allowed to run wild, this is the kind of thing that gets designed. So enormous issues with it, and hopefully it doesn't come to reality. And this is what it looks like. So as we build more roads, you have, if you look at the picture on the right side, right, you have issues of erosion and runoff and fragmentation. Obviously, if you have this wide of a right-of-way, that's basically impossible for animals to migrate across. It creates just a great wall to any sort of species migration, species movement. This is what sprawl looks like up on the left side here, this kind of development where you have just these low density single family homes running out into undeveloped land, forests and ag land, and these just dead end roads coming off of the arterials. You can see from this pattern of development here, the way this neighborhood here, if you can see the cursor kind of spinning around, right, all of those homes are channeled onto this one intersection. And so you can imagine the congestion that happens, every morning when all of these people are, taking their kids to school and trying to drive themselves to work. That's all coming out to this one intersection and getting onto this arterial road. So you can imagine how much traffic would back up there. Additionally, you can see, if you're living in some of these homes, you're not going to be able to walk anywhere, right? There's nowhere to walk to in these sprawling subdivisions. So it's just not conducive to anything but getting in your car and driving somewhere. So another mode of transportation we need to think about is pipelines. And so pipelines are becoming much more controversial. We talked a little bit about this when we talked about energy and how pipelines are used extensively to move natural gas, other resources around the country. And so this video here, not going to watch it all, well, assuming it opens here. There's about 2.5 million miles of pipelines across the country, and they're moving all sorts of things from natural gas to oil to water and other things. And so they are very reliable, and they're generally safe. Obviously, there have been examples of safety issues, particularly as our pipelines age and become more susceptible to decay and accidents that happen. So that's an issue that needs to be addressed in terms of maintenance. And when things do go wrong, because again, as we've sprawled out, we've built in proximity to some of these pipelines. And so when they do rupture, they can create some enormous problems in neighborhoods. When you have a natural gas leak or an explosion, obviously in proximity to homes. So pipelines are an effective way of moving things around, but certainly need to be properly designed, built, routed, and maintained. So waterborne transport is the oldest form of moving significant amounts of goods, right? We've talked about how efficiency of water transportation is much higher than on land. It still remains that way. You can move much more by water with much fewer emissions and much fewer environmental impacts when you do move stuff by boat. You can put a lot of stuff on a ship and move it for not a lot of energy as compared to trucks and automobiles, those kinds of things. But you do have some significant challenges from emissions, noise, dumping into waterways. That's one of the big ways that invasive species have been moved around, is in the ballast water that ships take on to help balance their load and maintain stability. They suck in water and whatever organisms and species come with it. Then they travel across the globe to their next destination, dump that water out, and whatever species are in there, things like zebra mussels and so forth, get introduced into a new environment. So it is one way that non-native species have been moved around through shipping, which is certainly an environmental issue. Additionally, the maintenance of port facilities can be problematic as we dredge harbors and so forth, a lot of that the stuff we're bringing up from the bottom of these waterways can be contaminated, and so then we have to dispose of that, and so we can increase contamination, move contaminated stuff around as we're dredging facilities. And obviously when you're dredging and digging up silt, you're changing the ecosystems, changing the habitat. So there are some challenges with waterborne transportation that we need to keep in mind, from the environmental impacts that come from that. So rail is another super efficient way of moving goods. So you can, again, move a lot of stuff on trains pretty quickly, pretty efficiently. Also because trains, for the most part, run separate from traffic. They can be much more efficient because they don't get stuck in the same congestion that trucks do. And so that's definitely a good thing. But obviously when you're moving, hazardous chemicals, oil, things like that, certainly that's a problem that we need to consider, because when train accidents happen, they're pretty spectacular and create a pretty significant environmental mess. Additionally, there is some emissions and noise and so forth associated with train traffic. And again, those train networks tend to be located in proximity to the lower income neighborhoods. And so again, those populations tend to have a higher impact from rail noise, rail emissions, and so forth than other communities do. So obviously our transportation system still relies on oil and gas, and so just producing the gas that we need, the oil that we need to run our transportation system, has an enormous impact on the environment, from the production, the movement through pipelines, and the refining of oil into gas and other products that we use has an enormous impact. A lot of energy gets used for that. So we're using, coal-fired power plants to power refineries that are turning oil into gas and other, more volatile compounds. And so we need to consider how our transportation system, again, looking at the whole picture of our transportation system, from getting the oil out of the ground to refining it to putting it into our cars, and then the impact that the roads and so forth has. So it's a pretty significant environmental impact, looking at the big picture of transportation from kind of cradle to grave thinking. So we are seeing increased attention in alternative fuel vehicles, things like electric cars, that are either pure electric or a hybrid, to where you have a gas engine, but also electric motors to power the car. Certainly those are good things. In terms of direct emissions that come out of them, right? So your electric car is zero emissions, but we have to think about the full picture of where the electricity comes from for charging your car. So if you're plugging your car in at night and you're getting your electricity from a coal-fired plant, you still have to account for those emissions, right? Your car is technically not zero emissions because you have to charge it and the coal plant is emitting stuff. So also we've talked about the environmental impacts of the batteries themselves. So if everyone runs out and buys electric cars, there will still be an enormous environmental impact from that. Whereas if you just keep the car you have, you can actually have a smaller overall footprint by keeping the current car longer than buying a new car, because you've already, the environmental footprint of your car has already been made in terms of mining the steel, all the other stuff that goes into it, building the car. All of that cost has already been spent, and now it's just the emissions you make on an everyday basis from your car, versus going and buying a new car where you're adding more to the environmental impact. So some of the other things we can do to reduce the environmental impact of our transportation system with alternative fuel vehicles, but also land use changes. That's really, if we want to have a big impact on the environmental footprint, we need to think differently about how we live. And so we need to encourage more density and more infill development that supports transit use. and creating neighborhoods where people don't have to drive as much. So that doesn't necessarily mean everybody has to live in big apartments or everybody has to live in the city. You can still have the suburbs, you can still have rural communities, but we need to think about creating, even within those more suburban and rural environments, we need to think about proximity to things like at least a convenience store where you can just walk and pick up a gallon of milk or things like that, to where you don't have to drive quite as much. Or putting, going back to the idea of neighborhood schools where kids can walk or ride their bikes to school, it's in proximity to their homes, right? So thinking differently about our land use is going to have a much bigger impact on our transportation network than things like electric cars and so forth. We need to think differently about how we build. We also need to think about improving and encouraging walking and pedestrian and cycling infrastructure to make it more attractive and more convenient and safer for people to walk or ride bikes. One of the reasons those modes remain such a small portion of our transportation system is because it's not safe in most of our neighborhoods to walk or ride your bike. So people that might be willing to or live close enough to their work or their school to ride or walk to it oftentimes don't, simply because it's not safe to try and get around outside of an automobile, right? Because our entire network is designed for cars. Using rail and water for freight movement, again, those are the most efficient ways to move goods around. And so if we can make that more accessible and increase that, it's going to reduce emissions rather than using trucks as the prime means of movement. And we need to think about how we route our transportation facilities and looking for routes that are going to have avoid sensitive habitat, provide minimum disruption to neighborhoods. We've talked a lot about that, how neighborhoods are disrupted by our transportation network. So looking for transportation routes that have the least impact possible as we're moving goods and services around. All of those things are going to reduce the overall environmental impact of our transportation system, make it more sustainable for the long term. So moving on to bike and pedestrian planning, as we talked about in the last lecture, right, this idea of multimodal or intermodal planning is becoming a much more popular thing. And so we need to think about how we can make cycling and walking more attractive and safer to get more people to do it. So a second thing I want you to do is to list the places you can get to on a bike or foot from campus versus your home. So when you were on campus, I want you to think about all the places you could get to, right? We're a pretty long list if you think about it. There's a full service grocery store a few blocks away, certainly all the bars, there's a movie theater, there's a lot of stuff right there in proximity to campus that you can get to, as well as obviously everything that's available on campus. And then think about where you are right now in your home, assuming you are at home, and think about where can you walk to from your home in a reasonable amount of time. So add that to your list of things that you're typing up for this assignment. All right, so just to break down, 87% of trips are in personal vehicles. So again, that's our single occupant vehicle for the most part is our primary mode of transportation. Most people, 91%, travel to work in their personal vehicle. Bicycle commuters are a pretty small percentage. And so if you look at the cities here with the highest level of bicycling commuters, Davis, California, Berkeley, California, Boulder, Colorado, Somerville, Massachusetts, Cambridge, Massachusetts, those are all big college towns, right? So UC Davis, UC Berkeley, Boulder's got UC Boulder, a bunch of socialist hippies there. Cambridge is where Harvard, MIT, a lot of schools are there. And so you can see, obviously Fort Collins, Colorado has Colorado State. So a significant number of these big cities with high rates of bicycle commuters are actually college towns. And so obviously college kids are more likely to ride than other people. And pedestrian commuters, no surprise there. Cambridge, Mass, again, big college town. Ann Arbor, Michigan, big college town. Berkeley, New Haven is where Yale is. Columbia, South Carolina is, I assume University of South Carolina, I don't know. Provo, Utah is where BYU is. Boston, Mass. So again, the bigger cities Madison's there in number 10. I'm a little bit surprised here about New York City being this low on the list, but I guess many people in New York City are riding the subway and stuff as opposed to walking to work. But you get the idea, right? Where we see high levels of bike and ped commuters is primarily college towns, students that can't afford cars or don't have cars on campus or don't want to pay the parking permit fees because they're kind of a giant pain. So we are seeing growing interest in alternative transportation. And so a couple reasons for that. One is to improve quality of life. People like to live in places where they can walk to destinations or ride their bikes. As we've talked about with economic development, businesses are looking for those communities with high quality of life, and having good bike and pedestrian facilities are a sign of a high quality of life. So communities are investing in those facilities as a way to make themselves more attractive to prospective businesses, encourage those desired workers to come to their town and support economic diversity and economic growth. So here we're seeing this example where transportation improvements are tied to quality of life, social improvements, and economic development. So you can kind of start to see some of those pillars, the 3 pillars of sustainability working together through bike and ped improvements. So this term level of service applies to automobile traffic as well as bicycle and pedestrian facilities. So you'll see level of service is basically the accessibility of a road to cars. And as the level of service decreases from like A down to E and F, right, the congestion on that road increases and it becomes less accessible or less desirable to travel on it. But when we apply that to bike and cycling facilities, we can see that a level of service is about the quality of the infrastructure that's available. And so basically, as you improve the facilities, you are going to encourage more people to ride. So down here at the bottom, level of service F is basically where the cyclist is expected to share a lane with the cars. That's the lowest level of service. That's the people that are going to be riding in that environment tend to be your more experienced cyclists, because it's, you're in right there with the cars. There's no protection. There's no segregation. You are basically just sharing the lane with cars and having them come right by you. Not very comfortable of an environment. When you look up at, say, level of service A, what you see there is a fully segregated bicycle lane with a physical barrier between the traffic and the bicyclists. So that's going to be your most comfortable environment. That's where you're going to see, you'd be confident in letting, a younger kid ride in that space because you have that physical barrier from the traffic. There's not a danger of them, losing control, going out into traffic, or cars, coming over into the cycling lane, because there's that physical separation. So that's your highest level of service, and that's going to encourage the most number of people to ride, because even people that aren't super comfortable or super confident on a bike will feel safe because of that physical barrier from the roads or from the cars. For pedestrians, we want to think about, again, the same level of service can be applied there, from basically your highest level of service where you have nice wide sidewalks, you don't have overcrowding, people have freedom to move around, you can keep your social distancing in place that we're all doing right now in terms of 6 feet apart or whatever, because the facilities allow for that, down to where you're getting into a much more congested, much less comfortable environment where people are crowded, where you actually have congestion on the sidewalks that makes movement less safe, less accessible, less easy to move around. So you also have an issue of comfort and safety. So you do want a certain level of activity to make the environment feel safe and welcoming, but not so much that people feel, pushed upon or pressed upon and don't feel safe. So we talked about desire lines when we did our walkabout. That's where you have people, creating their own path. So when we talk about sidewalk and pedestrian planning, this is where you start. You go and look in your community for these desire lines where people are creating their own path and build your sidewalks there. That's going to be your best bet, your best bang for your buck. Also, you want to look at where people are crossing roads, right? So in this picture here, you have, a park over here. Looks like there's some activity. Who knows what's on this side, but you see that people are going to cross the street here because there's a sidewalk here in the park. It's a desirable place to be. So this may be a place where you want to put some kind of mid-block crosswalk or something in that place there. So when we talk about how we actually do bike planning, you want to look at things like your crash data. And so this is a map here that shows high hotspots for bike and pedestrian crashes. And so you can track that data and see where you're having high incidences of crashes. And that's going to be places you want to focus improvements to improve safety and make the facilities more accessible by reducing those crashes, making it safer for people. Because obviously when you have car versus bike crashes, guess who loses? Generally, it's not the car. And then you want to do an inventory of your facilities. So think about where you have bike lanes. So conventional bike lanes tend to be just a stripe, right? Where you just paint a stripe on the road and say, this is the bike lane, this is the vehicle lane. Shared lane markings are where you have what they call sharrows sometimes. That's where you expect cars and bikes to share a lane or maybe through an intersection, that kind of thing. And then your low stress facilities are those that are segregated from traffic. So multi-use path, protected bike lanes, buffered bike lanes. Those are things that you're actually creating a physical space between the cars and the cyclists. Those facilities, again, are going to be lower stress, more attractive to less confident cyclists to use. And you can also look at where your cyclists are riding right now. So start to track user info, either from surveys or other options. You can look at where people are riding now, start to look at those main roadways that they're using to ride to destinations on, and those can again be priorities for improvements. And then you start to identify your gaps. So you start to look at your existing facilities, you start to look at your destinations where people are walking and riding to and from, and you start to put those two things together so that you can say, okay, if we have a ton of people that are riding on this particular road, let's go ahead and invest in a segregated bike lane or a bike path on that route, because that's a high traffic area and we want to make it safer and more convenient for cyclists to use, right? So that gap analysis lets you identify and prioritize areas for new facilities to get built. And then you want to design your facilities. You want to think about what level of service you're trying to achieve. Do you need to invest in a segregated bike lane? Do you need to, could it just be accomplished with painting and striping and those kinds of things, or do we need a actual physical barrier like what we have here at the bottom picture, where you have parking down here, you've got a sidewalk, you've got the bus stop, and the cycling lane is physically segregated from the roadway? Or up here where you have parking on the curb, you have your designated bike lane, you do have a buffer. It's not a physical buffer, but you have, a 2 or 3 foot painted stripe between the travel lane and the cycle lane. So you have a little bit of protection, even if it's not an actual physical barrier. And down to facilities like this, where you're actually trying to encourage cycling over automobile traffic by creating these kind of pass-throughs that allow cyclists easy access to the roadways, and cars have to take a more circuitous route. And so it's more convenient to be a cyclist in this kind of environment. So you're encouraging people to ride over driving by making it easier for cyclists to get around, cars have to take a more circuitous and longer route to get to their destination. So lots of different ways you can make cycling more attractive, more appealing, through the physical design of your streets and your network. So again, if you want to make cycling easier and safer and more attractive, you can incorporate things like this into your design to accomplish that. Oops, wrong way, sorry. You can also design for pedestrians. This is Times Square. A few years ago, they made Times Square. They decided to pull the cars out of Times Square to make it a real pedestrian network or pedestrian space. And so what they've done is they've basically taken out the throughways that run through Times Square on the north to south axis, so you can still get across it east to west, but the roads through are very narrow, so the cars are naturally slowed. You've created an enormous pedestrian plaza here with some seating, and it's become a very attractive place and a very safe place for pedestrians to be. On the example here, this is actually just a painted crosswalk, but it's painted to look three-dimensional so that it looks like those white stripes are actually floating, and it's a way to slow drivers down, because they're going to do a double take when they see that and think, am I going to run into something? It's naturally going to slow them down. So for pedestrians in this crosswalk, that creates a much safer environment, because the design of the crosswalk forces drivers to pay attention because it's kind of out of the ordinary and shocking. Down here we have an example of a bulb out. So in this case here, what you've done is you've actually physically shortened the distance that pedestrians have to walk across the street, so it makes it easier and safer for pedestrians. Also, by narrowing the driveway, you naturally slow traffic down. Drivers are going to slow down because the road is narrower here, and you've got the parking here, so when there are cars parked here, that's going to also help narrow the driver's vision and make them drive slower. So those are just some examples of how you can improve pedestrian access and safety, just through some pretty simple, this is a pretty significant change, but this crosswalk, these bulb outs are fairly small investments that you can make to improve safety. And you want to think about wayfinding and signage. If you're going to encourage people to walk, you want them to be able to find their way around. And so because people are walking and they're moving much slower, you can put a lot more information on signs than you would if it were designed for automobiles. If you look down here at the bottom, you can see that the signage designed for automobiles is much simpler. It's got simple symbols, P for parking. Because cars are moving faster, they have less time to really analyze and assess signage, and so you want to keep the message simple, keep it big and easy to see. Whereas for pedestrians, you can put a ton of information, because again, they're walking slowly and they're going to take more time to look at the map, read the notes, see what's going on, because they're not moving quickly. So you want to have good signage, good wayfinding to ensure that people can find their way around. So some other issues, if we want to encourage more cycling and more walking to work, is that we, even just something as simple as having showers in offices is helpful, because depending on the environment you live in, right, if you're riding your bike to work in Texas in the summertime, you're going to need a shower when you get there, because you're going to be pretty sweaty and pretty gross. So, having employers that provide showers at work, or having facilities that are available, like in downtown Austin, there's a bike shop that has showers that, if you ride your bike to work in downtown, you can stop at the bike shop, take a shower there, and then either ride the short distance to your office from the bike shop, or walk and not be hot and sweaty when you get there because you showered at the bike shop. So having those facilities is important if we want to encourage people to get to work not in their cars. Also, things like having a ride home option. If you do ride your bike to work, depending on how long that takes, and you get a call from school, your kid's sick, you need to go pick them up, or it starts to pour down rain, and you don't particularly want to ride home in the pouring down rain. Having options to get people home is important. Obviously, with things like Uber and Lyft, that's become less of an issue than it used to be, because you can just call an Uber, get home that way, but you may not be able to get your bike home, so that becomes a problem. But certainly having access to options to get home are important. And there's some bike programs cities are putting in place, policies and practices to support those needs. There's also some just sort of ways to encourage biking to work. So there is a National Bike to Work Day. It's usually in May. I don't know why this one's in March, but usually it's in May. And so cities will have, restaurants will have tables out, having food and breakfast tacos, things like that, for people who ride their bike to work. Offering movies if you ride your bike to the park, right? Just making it fun and accessible and more acceptable to ride your bike or walk to work is something that cities are looking to do. Regional planning is becoming more of a thing. Again, as we think about transportation, it crosses jurisdictions, it crosses city limits lines. And so if we want to make biking and pedestrian access more accessible, we need to think bigger picture in making it more convenient and easier for people to get around, not in their cars. And so cities like San Diego, Denver's got a great network of bike lanes across the entire metro region of Denver. So there's a lot of cities that have jumped on this idea. Minneapolis, St. Paul has done quite a lot in terms of bike facilities across the jurisdictions there. So making it easier, safer, more attractive for people to get around, not in their cars. Bike shares are becoming quite a thing now. Also, the little scooters are becoming more common. Most trips in cities are less than a mile, which is perfect for a bike or a scooter. So, instead of getting in your car, driving, having to find parking, having to pay for parking, all of those costs associated with trying to drive your car in cities, many of those trips can be replaced by a bicycle or a scooter. And because the trips are short enough, you're not going to get hot and sweaty, and it's not going to be an issue. So the more we can make these options available, the more we can take cars off the road for those very short trips, and the less congestion we get from people looking for parking spaces and so forth. So certainly a benefit as we're seeing more cities adopt bike shares. And when we have more pedestrian and more bicycle access, we have better communities. We have safer communities. We have more welcoming communities. People like to be places they can walk around. And so when you make the pedestrian environment more friendly and more attractive, people are going to spend more time in a place. When they spend more time in a place, they spend money. And so there's an economic benefit to creating walkable spaces. You can't spend money in a parking lot, but if you're walking through, a nice downtown with lots of different shops, you're going to stop in multiple places and spend more money. We also get a lot of environmental benefits from improved biking and pedestrian accesses or facilities. So we're reducing air pollution, we're reducing noise, we're reducing the stress that goes along with, high-speed traffic and high-volume traffic and those things. We're creating a stronger sense of community. So there's lots of upsides to having these facilities and these amenities. So that's what I got today. A couple things that you are assigned to do. So I want you to, let's go back to it here real quickly. So listing all the places you can get to on a bike or foot from campus versus home. And the other one is thinking of the environmental and economic costs associated with driving a car. Whew, this was a long one. Hope you're doing well. Take care of yourselves. I will see you next time.